not really two things that go together very well, and it's not something that you automatically make a connection over to say agile. It's not something that you make a connection with the software architecture people. So I think probably the background of this presentation is very different. The first is that most of my experiences around agile have been from an offshore consulting model, offshore outsource model. And those of you from product background might have slightly different experiences. So what I would like to encourage actually is that once we get the Q&A session, that you all can share what experiences you all do have from what the background is, even if it dovetails with the experiences I've had or not. Please feel free to share your thoughts. What is software architecture? There's plenty of answers to that question. Some of them useful, some of them not so useful. And whoever you ask will probably give a different answer. So it's not perfect. Either it's just a structure system, sometimes for the high-level structure, the actual discipline, the activities that go into develop that structure. To document the same, you come up with a question of how we kind of adapt. Someone just hands you a book, right? The specification, it's the word that has led to a lot of argument, a lot of confusion as to actually what this architecture is. The blueprint is another interesting word, but you get so many definitions. So there's plenty, and I'd like to focus on a couple of definitions that I came across by some agile gurus. One is Martin Powell, the chief scientist of ThoughtWorks. He said it's design, but we like to sound important, so we dress it up as architecture, right? And he actually said this when he was coming up with his book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. And he was very comfortable defining the word for himself. A slightly practical, useful definition would be all the decisions we wish we could get right at the beginning of the project. And this was by Ralph Johnson. The name must be familiar to you all, and because you already asked questions later, and just throw some questions out to you all right now. Ralph Johnson, in business. The gap of hope is not a gap of hope. And he involved what he actually seems to focus on the XP area, which has been caught on as much as most people thought. But he's giving his thoughts, and actually there's a lot of truth to that. So we will look at how agile affects software architecture, bearing in mind to a large extent about the decisions that we like to get, like the touch points, the interaction points between people and processors, and of course technologies. Right? The first question that we could ask ourselves is, agile isn't mandating specific software architecture. Right? So what is the linkage? As long as there's software architecture, as long as there's software, there are people who will be preparing that architecture. And automatically that means to get those people working together, you need some sort of process. And that's where agile feels different from agile to the people. And agile has always been about the people. The entire spirit of agile has been about people over processors. So that's really where the tie-up happens. But I think it's very important to understand right from the beginning that agile is not mandating specific software architecture as such. No tools are mandated, but there's a bunch of guidelines, a bunch of principles. But if you are applying agile, and if you do have a software architecture that you are trying to deliver, definitely there is some impact, and we will discuss these specific touch points as we go forward. So, a few further questions. How many of you actually come from an environment where agile was you all have perfect agile in implementing in organizations? And by perfect, I mean, the planning happens as it is meant to. You all have your product backlog, the sprint backlog. You all conduct your retrospectives. You take a feedback from the retrospectives and you actually implement them. No show of hands, so I'm probably down to the right place. Okay. So, alright, good. And there's possibly a reason that, if you come from a product background, there's much higher chance of this being the case, where you'll be seeing this perfect agility. Why? You get looking for control realities. But this isn't always true from the offshoring and the outsourcing perspective. Why? We have this whole customer service provider. The there was the us mindset versus us, or us and us, home and right? If I go put it that way. How have not been used? let's say your package is, you're sending it out to the customer, right? And then someone tells you, look, we missed out on the feature, or there's a little defect that I've introduced here, and now what do we do, right? And then someone says, you should probably talk a minute. And then some other bright spark, he says, well, why don't you just fix it in the next release and send it out? Ever faced that? Never faced that? Well, I haven't never faced it, but I'm sure you all know some situation like that, right? And if truly the customer can leave a one, at least in spirit in mind, why is this a problem? So automatically you see that this whole offshoring and this outsourcing thing brings in that mentality of them versus us, and sometimes you've actually got to take extra steps to break out from that mindset. Building models, right? And this is where actually we diverge a little bit from the pure technical aspects of software, because some of these building models, the way you actually charge your customer, is also going to on all of us. If you say, all right, you deliver this software for this amount, you already brought in one constraint. It's not a technical constraint, it's not a requirements constraint, but is it going to affect how you do your work? Absolutely. If you're using something like time and materials where for every additional hour you get to charge them, great. But that probably means that to your own company it's probably beneficial to work extra hours, right? So how could this whole agile like to work 40-hour weeks? So perfect agile? Maybe not, right? So there you go. Communications audience. Some of my most productive agile projects to some extent have been the ones where I've worked with the Scandinavian market. Why? English is not there as like right? And there are lots of talking about these things, but also the US, also the UK, Australia, it may not work out as easy. So sometimes you have to make sure that your communications are clear. And whenever there are misunderstandings, you have to take extra steps to make sure that they don't have any negative effects. Culture shock is another point that I'd like to bring up, because you go to the US, you find people driving on the wrong side of the road, or we like to call it the wrong side of the road. People are a lot more, let's say, upfront, right? It doesn't necessarily work well with the Asian mindset. Problems like that can be overcome as well when you're working with offshore outsourcing. Different levels of experience. To share one personal experience of a project that I worked with, I had a team of about 10 engineers. At that point, I had about 6 years of experience, my first engagement as an architect. The average experience of my team, the SSCs, was possibly 3-4 years. So I put on this project. We've kind of dug ourselves into the hole which we're trying to dig ourselves out of now. And I'm going to go and talk to the architect. Right? So I get on a call. And before I get on the call, I talk to the PM who is leading the project now. Look, give me a profile of this architect and their name. The architect was about 50 plus. And he had about 25 years of experience, right? There are senior software engineer called Roger, I think, had about 16 years of experience. I think there are guys who worked on this project right here. And the gap that we faced was huge. And there was a time when to become an architect when you had 40 plus, and you had to have a political, and things have obviously changed. Beneficially for me, of course, but things have changed and expectations are different. So how do you overcome these? Is this something that software architects, that is relevant to software architecture? Is it relevant to software architect? I would posit that it does, and we'll cover those as we go ahead. So, the software architect is a lucky person who gets to balance all of these constraints. Why? Because when you're heading up the technical team, you actually get to work with the management. So, costs have been taken into consideration, deadlines. You're not operating on your own. Right? At the same time, you've got to lead a team. You've got to look to their welfare, as well as deliver a project. So, it's not exactly the easiest of jobs, but that's exactly why it's so rewarding, and it requires that you wear multiple hats at different times. And on occasion, you wind up wearing multiple hats at the same time as well. Why we focus on software architect really so much on this presentation, or during this presentation, is because when we started on this road was preparing this presentation, I had a chat with the organizer, and my first question to them was software architecture and agile. Right? Now, what do you want me to talk about? And what we figured out is that we reach out to the architects here, or wannabe architects, sometime in the future, 5-10 years down the road. And if we discuss the real problems, right, that you are facing or might face, and we look at possible suggestions, solutions during this discussion, then it will probably add value. And hopefully, as you all go and apply those in the architecture that you have prepared on a day-to-day basis, that you all will see some real value coming out of this session today. So that's how we are going to approach this entire session, rather than just software architecture and agility. True, that's what we are ultimately talking at heart, but we are going through the software architect's role to try and get the message across. So I'd like to lay all of that out at the beginning of this whole introduction, just so that when we start talking about the different aspects of the software architect's job, that it won't come as something out of left field or something that you didn't expect. If you have any questions, feel free to raise them, because I'd much rather you all ask questions, right? You are going to wait for it, right? Yeah. So the first step is the architect as a guide, right? And by guide in this case, we are thinking of someone who knows the path, who's been there before, who's climbed Everest before you, and who's now guiding you along the way, right? This works by and large, right? Within the right framework, within the right environment, it does work. But it doesn't necessarily work at all solution scales. I'd like to take an example of, let's say, for example, an enterprise. Right? An enterprise, let's say, for example, there's so many modules, so many systems that are meant to be integrated. It does help to have someone who's got a little bit further insight, who actually thinks about the big picture further down the line, rather than just leaving the solution to emerge. Because let's face it, with Agile, the solution would emerge. I have every confidence in Agile that the solution would emerge. But you might reach that point more efficiently, sooner, and in a smarter fashion if you had someone who was looking at the longer term. So this is to some extent counterbalanced by intentional architecture, which is looking down the road, saying this is what the solution could look like, should look like, and thinking of everything else to kind of fit into that pattern along the way. To reference a paper by Martin Fowler, who presented this IEEE paper on who needs an architect, he refers to the mastermind kind of architect. If any of you have watched The Matrix Reloaded, I think there was the architect, the mastermind, who thinks, who has everything up in his head, that kind of role, versus a more collaborative guy who's also an architect at ThoughtWorks, a guy called David Rice, who's in the morning he's working with the dev team, and in the evening he's maybe working with the requirements, right, to try and explain something in non-technical terms as to why something would work and why something would not. So this entire spectrum of collaboration versus looking at the big picture and further down the line actually needs to come into play from time to time, and this is not something that Agile always advocates. So if you are faced with a situation like this on whatever project you're doing, there are certain solutions or certain ways that you could approach it, right? And that is to come up with a thin slice or reference implementation that looks at the big picture, that covers some of the aspects of the big picture, right? How many of you are familiar with reference implementations and thin slices? So just for those of you who are not, it's pretty much taking scenarios, functional scenarios. Let's say, for example, a simple one, sign in or sign off, right? And implementing a solution across layers, and hopefully covering as many of the tricky pieces and things that you need to validate across the architecture along the length of the project, right? I mean, there are Agile projects that run to 30 sprints, 40 sprints, 50 sprints. And the last thing you want is when you get to sprint number 38, come to the realization that there's a lot of stuff to be unbound, right? So this is actually where this thin slice reference implementation could help out. It also works as a guidance mechanism. Why? You bring on new guys onto the project. You start up, you recruit a couple of people into the project, and then they've got to get up to speed. So if they've got a sample implementation, which has actually now been evolved into your overall solution, it will actually allow them to get up to speed much faster. But to me, the primary reason why you need to do something like this is because it needs to validate your architectural concept right up front. And if you are finding it hard to justify to others, rethink, right? You really got to think about, all right, if I can't explain to someone else, how are the guys who are coming onto this project at a later point going to be able to understand this architecture? Does it work? Does it not? If I can't justify it, there's a good chance that you're going to crash and burn. But if you can't justify it yourself, control reset, undo, rewind, and try and work forward. Meaning you might have taken a wrong turn if you can't justify it yourself. Moving on to head number 2, the architect as a negotiator. Right? There are scenarios, especially at the start of the project, where I mentioned the reference implementation, but if you're going for a reference implementation, you need to identify early on, and possibly in your first sprint, sprint 0 as we sometimes like to call it, that certain architectural stories and epics, a composition of stories, need to be implemented. And sometimes it's hard to justify these. In a pure agile mindset, sometimes it's a little bit hard to explain to customers as to why we should do this upfront. I'll explain this from the perspective of agile, that agile is always about bringing business value, taking that which is most important and delivering it as soon as possible. And if you're trying to justify to a customer why we should implement caching, or try it out at the beginning, or try and build those framework of component parts early on, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to explain to them why they do not see the business value of it. You can implement it, fine, you run it, and they don't see value in it. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get it done or get them convinced as to, or fully bought in heart as to why these stories and ethics need to be implemented early on. But you, the architect, from having worked in that environment, know that it's absolutely necessary. Because just imagine, again, 38 sprints down the road, you've gotten yourself code base, and at this point you're now trying to plug in caching. Right? Think about all of the regression testing that you have to do. What about touching code that has already been written and is working? What about the risks of introducing defects? Right? There's all of these problems that you could be faced with. So if you're actually looking ahead, you know from experience there are certain things that are worthwhile doing early. Security components, data access frameworks, let's say your approach to transactioning and concurrency. Security is another classic one. Globalization, world readiness, trying to support multiple languages. All of these things are decisions that tend to keep coming up much later than they ideally should. So if you're faced with these situations, how do you go about taking them on? The first thing I would suggest is try and show the costs and the benefits of taking this on earlier versus later. Now, some of these things are always hard to put into rupees and cents or dollars or euro, as the case may be, and sometimes that might be the only thing that the customer understands. So again, that's up to you to try and justify it as best as possible. Sometimes however much you explain it in words, they don't get it, so you might have to put it into numbers. Right? So it's up to you to find the right way to tackle your customer who might actually be requiring convincing. Also, use the option to validate the clarity of your stories. So you come up with a bunch of stories and you're saying, okay, we need to take caching on, let's say security, and let's say data access for stuff. I would say when you're faced with this situation, use it as a double check for yourself. Double check yourself, because there's always a chance you might have made a mistake. You might be over-prioritizing something. See whether it's truly required. Because, hey, rather than convincing the customer that we need to do this much, it's a much harder sale to try and convince them of having to implement 10 stories rather than 5 stories. So try and cut it down to bare bones, what's absolutely necessary, and then try and pace it out. That might be one way that you could tackle it. I've also come to this realization that not just the stories, but there's a bunch of other things that you ideally want to get working first up. One example would be your release process. How are you going to do your releases? Automate them, script them, or are you going to go with the manual approach of building whatever IDE that you're using, grab the files and put it in your zip file, or do you want to automate? Do you want a release documentation with that? Would you like to get your unit testing approach sorted out first up? want to identify, let's take an example that keeps hitting us all the time. Let's say unit testing, setting up of test data. Are you going to use scripts? Or are you going to use something like a framework like MUnit, which might allow you to roll back any of your test data which is entered through a unit test as well? Those things actually tend to come and bite us when we start implementing them later. So here's a suggestion. Try and get those things sorted out as early as possible. It's something that I'm implementing right now in our company that, sprint 0, our first sprint, get these things sorted and out of the way. And as you keep doing it on more and more projects and your company gets used to it, your teams get used to it, it costs less and less as you go along. Another scenario about negotiation, when the architect has to do a fair bit of negotiation, is technical debt getting wrapped up. So I'm pretty sure all of you know what technical debt is, but let's say you run your project, the classic 30, 39, 40 sprints of 55, and you found lots of clutter in your code base, bad code smells, as we like to call them, and you're wondering about whether this is the right time to get it sorted out or not. So what's the positive and the negative? What's the negative of taking it on right now? You're probably going to spend time writing code which is not functionally important. Right? You are going to wind up undoing stuff that worked thus far, and that's a risk. But what are the advantages? You're clearing up things, so your momentum going forward is probably going to be faster. But how do you convince people of this? Again, it's not easy, right? And especially for someone who's going to look at it from a dollar value, it's not going to be easy. So it will require a little bit of ingenuity, right? Take, let's say, for example, the work you've done. Pain points that you're facing immediately. Adding this feature took us this much time. We estimated, for let's say 8 hours, it took us 12 hours. And as we keep implementing features in this module, it's only going to get harder. Take a few numbers, show the disparity. Let's say 8 hours versus 12 hours, 4 hours disparity, and identify your hourly rate for that engineer, and then pitch that cost to the customer and say, we are going to keep incurring costs like this going forward. Why don't we take a step back, clean up our code base, and move forward? Technical debt is probably a hard one sometimes to convince purely because technical debt only gets racked up as you go along. And by now the customer is actually here is not by bringing in frameworks, it's not by bringing in any tools, it's always about the people, right? And I'd like to bring in a couple of twists that we see from the offshore perspective typically, right? And that is fixed timelines, right? You all would have always deadline pressure, I'm sure, right? At the very least, anyone here from a campus would know the pressure of an assignment schedule, right? So, if you've got a fixed timeline, and now we are approaching that deadline, right? How do you convince a customer that it's actually to their interest, to their benefit to take a step back and slow things down, right? How are you going to convince them on that? To your experience, you might think it absolutely mandatory that this be reworked. But what if the client happens to be code savvy as well? A lot of the agile projects that come our way are actually from other software companies which are augmenting using our stuff, right? So if you're faced with that scenario, it's not like trying to give a dollar value. Here, you get all sorts of technical arguments and discussions with other people who will give you a pretty hard brief, right? Let's say it's a person who doesn't understand technicalities and you can just give them the dollar value, you might be able to convince them. But what about someone who's lived their lives doing code reviews? They will probably ask you, do you really need to do this? Probably it's a good thing. This is not a negative, right? There's a positive and a negative to it both, right? But if you're in a situation where your experience tells you and your gut feel tells you that this is something that needs to rework, you might find some difficulties in actually convincing them of this. And again, the approach to it, the approach you need to take is give them the facts. Give them the numbers, where relevant. Ultimately, if final call is on their side, some battles you win, some battles you lose, right? You've got to take that on the bump as it comes up. But where possible, if it's, let's say, code issues, you can take reports from tools, like let's say, for example, code duplication. I think that will be a good example because that's something that's becoming more and more visible through the tooling that's available today. Right? What you could do is you could use those reports, show the costs. Right? Let's say you've got duplicated code and a bug comes up in one, guess what? You've got to fix it in all the duplicated places. Right? So that's something that you would, that's an approach that you would use to taking on a customer and explaining this to you. But I would also suggest that you work with the team and the customers to preempt as much as possible, right? It's rather than making the issue is actually an issue. Try to talk to them beforehand, try to prevent issues. 2 steps of design is probably better than 3 of implementation, right? Rather to design a little bit extra, right? And I'm not talking big upfront design. I'm not talking, sit down and architect the whole thing, design the whole thing and then get to it. But while you are at work, just think 2 steps ahead of the game and see where it's leading you. Right? And if you can, talk to the customer beforehand and see, I see this problem coming up. So when the problem actually does come up, you actually have ammunition in your hands to try and convince them. And at the very least, you'll have the satisfaction of saying, I told you so, right, at the very least. Right? Continuous integration is your best friend, however, in this situation, where if you've got tools, like, let's say now, in our company, we use cruise-control.net, right? And there are tools like Jenkins, Hudson, where you can actually get, with every check in your code building, right? And let's take the example of code duplication again. With every check-in, if someone is introducing duplicate code, copy and paste, very helpful, I'm sure, helps with productivity, but the root cause of more duplication than anything else, right? The architect has fingertip level information. You can feel the beating pulse of your team pretty much live, and you can get those things sorted out sooner rather than letting it get worse. What's the problem with debt, typically? Either technical debt or in human debt, what's the problem? What's the pain point of debt? It's the interest, right? And the longer you've got this problem in your code base, the longer you let it live there, the more costly it's going to be to pull it out. So that's why timeliness is the most important thing here. And that's why I'm saying continuous integration, because you get that information and you can fix it sooner, almost immediately if you can. But even better, go a step back and try to preempt it. And if you can get these things nailed down, I think your life as an architect is going to be a lot easier during the course of your project. The architect as a technologist. Now, let's say you're faced with a technical risk on your project. So I think I haven't asked any questions for a while, so let's throw these out there. Name a few technical risks on the projects that you have faced. Thoughts? I hate to call out names, but I know a few names, so I'm not going to hesitate calling out you guys, right? Any technical risks that you have faced?
Outdated.
Absolutely. What framework is it? Right? Because if you got something that's not being maintained, right, and you don't know whether that's not going to be supported, do you go for that or do you go for something else? Let's say, for example, you want to move to something like Memcached. Now, this is something that has been troubling me for a while. Lots of people are using Memcached as your caching server. It's been tried, it's been tested, but I'm from Microsoft.NET background, and then all of a sudden throwing in a few Linux servers into your farm, all right, and just to keep costs low rather than splashing out of Microsoft licenses, right? There's a bit of a pushback internally. Do I want to move to that? What are the risks? Hey, what if I need to restart the server and I don't know the command? Right? I mean, these are all the little questions that come up, right? There are others. I mean, what about, let's say, this data access framework, N-Hibernate versus Entity framework, right? So, all of those are risks because, let's say, especially the first time that you're doing it, the chances of a mistake are much higher. Let's face it. That's a natural course of events. And if you make a mistake, forgive yourself. Your team is going to pay the price of that down the length of the project, right? And goodness knows, it might turn out to be a debt of a different sort which you have to rework at a different point, at a further point down the road. And as I said, debts cause interest, and that means it's going to be more expensive to rework it and undo it later. So, when you're faced with a situation like that, and obviously it's going to be costly if you take the wrong choice. The agile angle to this that I say is that the customer collaboration is to prioritize over contract negotiation. So over costs, what we should try and do is try and bring the customer on board with these risks, right? And a lot of these things, you all might have gotten the trend by now that a lot of these things are influenced by and large by the customer, but I think that goes back to slide number 1, where I said that when you are talking offshoring and outsourcing, it's really a customer-driven game, right? And a lot of our successes depend on how we deal with the customer, right? The technical solutions, I'm pretty sure for the techies here, that's actually the simple part, right? And that's the fun part. And typically that's where, the problems that we can control come up from. But if you talk about handling a customer, well, that's a whole new ballgame, right? Let me add a small challenge from the offshore perspective, right? So with all of these slides, as I said, I give you the scenario, I'll say what agile perspectives might bear on it, as well as what additional problems might be caused by the offshore angle. Fixed bid pricing. Let's say you try to bid a project, right? We do a pre-sales, we talk to our customers, right? And they actually come on board with us. They expect you to know everything, right? And you seal the deal, you sign off on an amount for the project, right? Why we want a customer. They are not willing to, they are too smart to go down the time and materials approach maybe, right? But, or maybe they just drove a harder bargain, right? But for whatever reason, now the project is in, it's a fixed bid project, right? And now you're coming up with the architecture. And the customer might be finding it by, of course, they're paying on a fixed amount, right? Who's going to be managing you? Your boss. Your management is who's going to be managing you. And justifiably so. And this brings a lot of questions to the architect. Right? Do I go with the thing that I know? Do I go with the safe option? Or should I actually go with what's best for the customer? Right? So, customer collaboration. Why not talk to the customer? Why not try and bring them on site with you, saying, look, for this reason, right, we are actually going with this framework. Something that complicates it again is if the customer has a technical team. If they're going to review your code, your solution, right? Then they could always ask, why did you go with this emerging technology rather than something else? Right? Sometimes, through customer collaboration, you might even be able to undo some of these fixed bid issues. You might actually be able to talk to them and say, all right, we committed to this amount, but it was based on these assumptions, based on using frameworks like this. But hey, you could use these new technologies, which will keep you guys future-proof for maybe 3 years, 5 years, who knows? So why don't we go ahead and let's say sign up for an additional amount, right? And we will estimate it for you, and we'll get this job done for you for this additional amount using the new tech. Why not? Why not? So as I said, some of these problems aren't to be solved by using pure tech, right? A lot of these problems can be solved more by talking to the customer. That dialogue, that idea of debate and dialogue, of collaborating with the customer and coming together with a unified solution goes more to the heart of Agile rather than them and us and pricing and contractualization. So centrics, educate your customer, right? The more they know about Agile, the better your chance of success. Right? I'll be coming back to this point much later in the presentation, but the better your customers understanding of Agile, the more understanding they will be of your shortcomings, your strengths. The more they understand about Agile and the more they understand about you, the better the chance of them becoming one team with you. One of the difficulties that I'm sure a lot of you all who have worked in offshore is that though Agile calls for the customer to be co-located with you. Right? With offshoring, that's one of the things that's, it's like a white elephant, or rather like a blue moon, right? It happens once in a blue moon. Sometimes you might have the chance of getting a customer down to your site, but then it's not for the duration of the project. They come, maybe clarify requirements, they go back, right? So where we don't have true Agile and where the customer is now back in their headquarters or back in their office, you need that level of additional understanding. And the moment situations like this come up, the more they know about it upfront, about the whole nature of Agile and offshoring, the better for you. It might mean some additional work, sitting down with them, explaining all of this stuff, but believe me, it pays you back. Proof of concept. How many of you are familiar with the term? POCs, as we call it. It's where you try to validate whether your ideas are going to be successful or not. You could always look at that whole reference implementation almost as a kind of POC as well, if you think about it. But what you want to do is, let's take the example that you took of technology. It might be outdated. Now, outdated is something that's going to happen in the future, so it's not something that you can necessarily prove through this. But let's say if it was a technology, right, and you want to know whether it will meet your need or not. Take a few samples, try to implement it, see whether it will work. If it doesn't, you haven't gone through the full expenditure of implementing it in your solution, and then to unwind it is probably a lot less costly. Right? the point that you made about the future is actually one of the toughest things to preempt as an architect, because the way technology is changing today, it's moving at a pace where the only guy who can lose out in an argument in the future is you, right? But unfortunately, that's also part of the game. So how would you go about a situation like that? One thing that you might be able to do in terms of future-proofing is examine technology trends, right? See what the need for a project is. If, for example, your customer is looking to go big, right, and they are trying to grow their business, you know that a lot more load is going to come on your system. If, let's say, for example, you're architecting a web application, right? So at that point, you can ask the right question. Again, customer collaboration. Ask them the right question to see whether you can elicit answers of their growth plans. Right? There are customers who sometimes come and say, well, is this thing going to work 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead? Right? And I want a piece of software that's going to work 10 years later. Right? But they don't even have a business plan or a roadmap, say where they want to be in 5 years or 10 years. So they don't know how their business is going to grow. But if their business grows, more users are going to hit the application which you're designing. Right? The data that you're going to pump through your system is going to increase. But if they can't tell you that, how are you going to be able to handle it? Right? So I think in this case, it's a lot about asking the customer the right question, at least get them thinking about it. And if they can give you the right answer, hey, then you design for whatever answer they give you. Right? But if you don't ask the question, I've faced this situation and it's been a growth curve for me actually. I mean, the customer comes up and says, well, hey, we thought you guys were the experts. Why didn't you ask us? Right? And especially in the early parts of your career when you're used to requirements in software out kind of model, and you're just learning the game yourself, you ask yourself, was it really our business to ask the question? And of course, there's a line of reasonable and unreasonable, but the more you can ask these questions early of your customer, actually the more they will value you, right? The more that they will become one with you in terms of that relationship, the whole agile concept of one team, as it were. The higher the chance of building up that relationship and having a customer who will keep coming back to you. So remember, try and ask as much as possible upfront, try and keep that dialogue going as much as possible with your customers. The architect as a mentor and a teacher. Now, this is actually my favorite one, because there have been times when you wonder whether you want to change careers or not at some point. And yeah.
About the previous slide, as you mentioned, one way is very clearly through collaboration. We try to predict what's going to happen in the future. The other approach could be actually, as a technologist, we can make our architecture more adaptive as well. So we actually attack from two fronts. One is we try to predict as much as possible through the collaboration, and as well as we try to make the system adaptive as much as possible, so that if something is changing in the future, we have a better chance of doing it at a low cost.
Great point. So that speaks to a lot of architectural attributes like maintainability, configurability, right? Make our software something, like you said, that we can keep growing. You don't build in any restrictive factors. But the cost, if I could bring up the cost of that, it's an additional level of development, right? And sometimes building software to be configurable means, for example, take the simplest example, you have if-else conditions where typically you wouldn't have. Configure for route 1, configure for route 2, right? And sometimes the added estimate for that might be a hard sell for the customer. It goes back to one of the other points I brought about earlier, that some things are valuable to us. As architects, we know the value of configurability, maintainability. We spend a lot of our time mentoring and teaching our team members about that. But ultimately, convincing the customer is the hard part. Convincing your team is typically never the hard part, right? You tell them, hey, there's a pattern which we can use to implement this, and hey, everyone will be running to implement it, right? But trying to convince the customer, that's the hard part. But point taken, I mean, the more we make our software maintainable, and if the customer is okay with it, I mean, that's just great. That's the ideal situation that you want to shoot for. And I think by talking to them, by showing them the value, if you can do that, I think you will have a satisfied customer, not just for the short term, but the long term as well. And one thing about continuing to keep that dialogue going with the customer is that, see, one of the things is that customers come to you because, all right, they are the software guys, and it's their business domain, right? And they don't really understand what we do all the time. So the more you hold their hands, the higher the chance that they will feel safe working with you. So the longer you keep doing that, the longer that partnership will keep going, the more return work you will get, right? Of course, that comes with its own share of problems. It's like a marriage to some extent, right? It comes with its own share of expectations and problems because after a while they keep asking for, discounts and stuff like that, and there are all sorts of other problems. But thankfully, some of those problems don't have to be solved by architects, right? The architect as a mentor and teacher. Thanks, by the way. Teams with less experience and skill gaps is the first point that I'd like, or is the point that I'd like to discuss under mentoring and teaching, because you have a team, right? I go back to that first example I took. Me with about 6 years of experience, or 5. The team with about 2 to 3. And on their side, there's a huge disparity. 27 years experience as architect, 16 years for the SSCs. The expectations are sky high. Those guys used to keep unit test code coverage levels at about 95 or 97% for fun, I think, right? And just to see how much we could be pushed for, right? And when you've got experience gaps like that, or skill gaps, let's say for example, a new technology has come out and you're about to start out on, goodness knows you've got a fixed bid on your head, right? And it's a new technology and you know that, alright, you know that this is the right decision. But knowing the right decision is one thing. Implementing that, that's the devil's usually in the details, right? When you try to implement it, you're taking longer than you estimated for, that you thought it might take. Again, some of those things can be taught, can be handled by talking to the customer. But one approach that you could take is mentoring or grooming your team, right? So when you talk about grooming, I mean, there's always trainings that can be done, right? One point that I just missed out on is that because Agile gives a lot of freedom. It's a very dynamic, vibrant kind of environment where everyone's putting in their thoughts and all of that. But along with that freedom comes a challenge of responsibility to take the right decisions, right? It's a great environment for ideas, for incubating those ideas and implementing them as a team. It's a great vibe, nothing ever better. Right? A lot better than having an architect tell you do this and then you can do that, right? It's a lot better. But it also calls for maturity and responsibility in the decisions you take, right? So what if that is missing? What if that aspect of experience, or let's say a skill gap is? How do you handle that, right? One benefit that works to your advantage, right, is that knowledge is more transferable in software. Methods, technology, practices, utilities, right? Experience is typically where you need a lot of experience when it comes to handling stuff like load, right? Performance, caching techniques. Those are things that you gain with experience. But let's say adopting a technology, how does it work? Let's say, for example, an MVC framework. Right? Those things can be actually taught to a large extent, and you can actually gain a lot of advantages in bringing a team up by taking the risk of adopting a new technology. Now, to any budding architects, my advice would be conservative at the start. Right? If it's your first time out taking this decision, it might make sense to go down the conservative route and not bite off more than you can chew. But after a while, once you can feel for that level of risk and how much can be handled by training, I would say it's actually worthwhile taking the risk. Why? There have been so many times, especially early on, where I've been faced with situations like this, and you go with the technology that you know, and you find the rest of the world moving on. So at a personal level, you actually held yourself back, right? But on a larger scale, you actually held your customer back. Why? The newer technologies are coming out, other people are adopting those, and you're actually running a little bit slower or a little bit behind the curve than you should be. Right? So it's an advantage that you're in software, because a lot of things are in blacks and whites here in software. That's a great thing. A lot of it is Boolean, right? So you can actually transfer that knowledge and then guide the team in the aspects where experience is required. Transfer knowledge often, look for teachable moments. So teachable moments would be, alright, you've gotten a team together, right, and you take a look at what they've implemented. Let's say, for example, they've made some mistakes, right? The simple solution might be to just say, do this, or read this reference, right? And your problem will be solved. They'll take quarter of an hour, right? Or half an hour, or 2 hours, whatever it is, and they'll solve it. But what would be of more use is if you actually sat down with them, right? And guided them through a better way of doing it, explain them the principles behind it, right? This is something that I do a fair bit with our teams in our office. Is that all right? One classic example that comes to mind is a fresh developer had made some mistakes with the implementation of concurrency, right? So it's very easy to say, all right, put a version column, right, and check against that version number when you're doing updates, right? But you spend a few more minutes to actually sit down with them and go through the concepts, right? Stuff that they learned at campus, which sadly we all forget when we move into industry, right? We just think, all right, assignments done, my exams are done, I got my degree, all right, let's call it that, right? You know, I've seen it happen. It's better to give your team members a little bit of a refresher, right? And now that they've done the theory, and you can show them practically how this is in use, the lesson you teach them there will probably last a lifetime. So this can be done at both project and organization level. So there's nothing stopping you from running a training for another team in your company, right? Knowledge sharing is always a good thing over lunch, right? I had a lot of fun actually preparing for these with some of the guys for this slide, for this presentation, discussing how different companies face some of these issues. And that knowledge sharing never stops as far as software or life is concerned. So I think it's something that the sooner we absorb it, the better it is for all of us. You can do it at project level as well, right? Of course, you need to talk to management, see how it will affect your project schedule and so on. But do it because it's well worth it, and the payback is definitely in the long term, right? But hopefully, in the shorter term also, you will see certain results coming, especially like I said, if you're using a new technology, the payback will be in the short term. But you will also see your team members growing as individuals. It's those moments that later on when you see them becoming tech leads and architects in their own right, you will realize that it's how you handle them that brought them up to that point, right? So I would suggest, I would encourage all of you all to actually think a little about this. Technologies, patterns and practices I think are the easiest ones on which you could transfer knowledge. But do make best use of downtime. Downtime means between projects. Let's say, for example, you're stuck on something, keep updating your knowledge, sharing your knowledge as much as possible. The architect is a communicator. How do you explain the architectural vision to your team? Right? So you've got an idea of how the architecture is going to pan out. Right? Your team initially might have only about 5 members, but you grow it as you go along. How do you explain that vision to them? Right? The normal approach would be document the heck out of it. Right? But here we are not talking about big upfront design. We are trying to steer clear of it. We are also trying to value the working software over comprehensive documentation, coming from an agile background. Right? So how do you actually get this knowledge across the team? And it's not just at the beginning. When you actually go into the maintenance of a project, right? The maintenance phase of a project, not having that documentation can sometimes come back to haunt you in a pretty bad way over the long term. So one approach that you could do or take is find the right amount of detail for you and your team. Right? What works for you? What works for your company? What works for your customer? Right? It could be mind maps, not you. Right? Your company might be you. You know class diagrams, or do you do class diagrams just to establish relationships, or you do your diagram to the extent where all the properties, methods, signatures are made up? So what's the right kind of granularity? And I think that's something that software architects always have to deal with, a lot of questions about granularity. What's the right amount? Right? And that's something that you won't be able to get away from. Find the right techniques, find the right amount, identify UML, use UML. Fine, that works for you. Domain models to complement them, great. Agile typically does not favor large documents, but the few documents that you have, which are typically living documents, have to speak volumes. And they've got to get the message across. And the success of how you documented it largely comes, or is largely found out over the long term, not over the short term. Sometimes you might have left that company and then you might get a word from your friends who stayed back, who tell you that, all right, because we documented it this way, maintenance is easier. The one thing though that I could encourage you on or try to encourage one is to make your code as readable as possible, right? Because if you do that, then the amount that you have to document automatically comes down by a fair bit. But it doesn't mean that you can get away from it completely, right? The architect is a diplomat, right? I don't know whether I'm qualified to speak on this, but I am going to try. The customer requests you to take on additional work mid-sprint, right? And this is possibly a nightmare scenario because we always talk about planning a sprint, and once you're in the sprint, you don't change your scope. Right? And that's agile, right? I mean, I refer to the perfect agile, right? But that doesn't always happen, does it? Right? So there's a friend of mine who went for his certified Scrum Master training a few weeks ago, about 4 weeks ago, and this question had come up during the training. And when he asked the question, the trainer who'd been there in the midst of the audience, he moves back to his table, he takes up a card and holds it up. And this card just says, just say no. Right? And why do we have a card? Why didn't we just give the answer? Because this question keeps coming up in all the trainings he does. Right? And from an offshore perspective, there's a lot of pressure. From an offshore consulting or outsourcing model, there's a lot of pressure that comes on us. Sometimes to change scope. And that scope creep is sometimes very, how do I put it? It's not obvious. Sometimes it comes in the form of, hey, can you change the color of this screen or this button? And it starts there, right? And then little by little, once they know that you're not going to say no, once they know that you're going to say yes, it's the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one, right? I'm not saying that we need to be absolutely rigid, but at least the sanctity of the sprint needs to be maintained. And that way the sanity needs to be maintained. Agile always talks about responding to change or following a plan, right? And the whole point of Agile right from the start was to be able to accommodate change. Never about being rigid. But the problem is that we wind up, that's not what Agile is about. Because uncontrolled change inevitably results in chaos. And this is something that I found once I joined the company, and they'd already committed to the customer saying that we'll get this work done for a certain amount. And hey, you know what? You guys aren't certain about the requirements? Fine. We'll just do this under Agile. Mind you, this was this company's first time doing Agile as well, so let's give them a break, right? Unfortunately, they'd done all of this before I joined, so there was absolutely nothing they could do by then. It was the project from here. I mean, there were 16-hour days, 20-hour days, right? And why? They went and told a customer who'd never done Agile themselves that we're going to do this to you in an Agile manner, for you in an Agile manner. And the customer probably took up a dictionary, looked up the word Agile, and thought, hey, cool, right? And then they pushed us for all they were worth, or rather all we were worth. And today, financially, I don't think the project ever turned over a profit. But what hurt more was, pulling those long hours, right? We got the project through, right? Functionally, it was a success. But I would think that all along the way, we made a lot of technology compromises, a lot of technical compromises. Why? Because we were being pushed by the functional scope, right? And honestly, looking back, I don't think we even had the time to lift up our heads and go back to the customer and advise them, say, hey, you know what? This is something that we should be implementing a different way. Why? Because every time we go to them and say something like that, they say, hey, we'd like you all to do this also for us. Right? And it's not an easy situation to be in, but like I said, if it was easy, anyone could do it. That's why they need architects, right? I would suggest, look to demonstrate impact. With all of these justify. Demonstrate to them the cost, the negatives. If you go down this path, right, if you take on the scope, something else has to follow. Right? Something else has to be taken out. Right? It might not be necessarily taking out something out of the sprint backlog because they're trying to make you do everything, right? Plus the added burden. What you say is, maybe code contributor. If you try to do it this way, maybe we won't be able to spend as much time dev testing the code. Right? And try and convince them that it's not in their interest to go down this road. Right? Another option is, of course, to just say no. Right? And I will say you go down the just say no route in the nicest possible way, right? Because once you say no to a customer, the person who will be coming to talk to you next is probably yours, right? So you probably want to have good reasons, good justifications. I'm not saying you should jump the gun on this one, but find the right way of communicating it. Right? And that's why rather than putting this under the architect as a communicator, I put this in the architect as a diplomat. My first idea was, I had to say no over a few times, so I thought I just put the architect as an executioner, but I thought I'd kind of, put something that sounded a bit better. We've come to the last step. Normally, we've got only 6 steps to talk about, but this time I thought I'd put in a 7th one. Right? So you've done all of your work. And yes, I know there are friends of mine here who hate the idea of the architect as a manager, but I'm sorry, you're probably one right now, right? You've done all of this work, you've handled all of these constraints, you've done all of this. How about filling in a few performance appraisals and doing a few interviews and stuff like that? So that's also part of an architect's job, right? Not the nice part of it, probably the stress-free part of it, except maybe the performance appraisals, right? Doing a few interviews are always fun. Right? But these are stuff that needs to be handled. So I would suggest to all of you that once you have reached this point, where that you're actually functioning as an architect because you've got to do all of that stuff plus this. This is to some extent the part which requires more people skills, right? In terms of doing performance appraisals and stuff like that. But I think a lot of what we discussed today centers around people skills, around soft skills. How to handle customers. I think that's really what we focused on today, and I think a lot of the problems that come up with Agile, especially in the offshoring and the outsourcing markets, is largely around how you handle the customer. I will summarize a few closing thoughts. I thought of this entire presentation and I tried to come up with a keyword that would explain what software architecture is, and the one that came to me was balance. Because all the time you're trying to balance between different constraints and forces which sometimes are conflicting. Right? You try to provide maintainability, it's going to hit something initially. Right? You try to provide configurability, sometimes code will be goes down. Right? You try to add unit testing to a high level of code coverage, it's definitely going to be questioned, no questions. From there on, I kind of try to figure out how do you describe an architect, and it's typically about someone who has to try and be all things to all people. You try to, be a communicator, you have to be a negotiator, you've got to be a diplomat, and sometimes be all of those. Some of those things actually run in the same direction, you've got to be all of those at the same time. And if you're actually thinking of going down the route to being a software architect, because typically, when we are in campus and you're just trying to move out, you typically think, all right, you know what, being a techie is a great thing. Software engineer, tech lead, architect. But these are the part that they don't really the lectures yet, right? So I thought we should cover some of these things because when you come to a meetup like this, you get people from different environments, students, and those who've been in the industry for a number of years. And there's always stuff that you can pick up along the way. The closing thoughts, key takeaways, the most critical challenges, especially today, with recessions going on, countries trying to come out of recessions, most things are driven by financials. They always were, but it's more obvious today. Right? There was a time during the .com boom where pretty much every project that came was time and materials. Right? And the more hours you work for, the more you can charge the customer. And back then, they were happy to pay. Today, customers, especially the US, Australia, a lot smarter. Right? They've been exposed so much to outsourcing and offshoring that they are a lot sharper about cost control. Right? So the rates that we could charge back in the day are not what they were. So how does this affect software architect? Well, refer the prior slides, right, for a lot of those issues. But just to summarize, fixed bid and agile can be made to work. Sure, but it's tricky. Right? We say, all right, we'll do this project for let's say $10,000, $20,000. Can be done. Run a few sprints, you can do it. But a lot of it depends on how much the customer is willing to be accepting of your saying no. Right? If they keep asking you, or can we do this also, can we do this also? Probably not. Not for that amount. Right? Time and materials, which It's a dying breed, from what I see, is a better fit. But if you've got a customer who's willing to pay you on P&M basis, for goodness sake, don't let them go. Right? Keep them because they're making gold. Right? Second takeaway, look to address the specifics of your problem scenario. One thing that I've also noticed is that when we start down the route of Agile, sometimes we bang the Agile drum only, and we don't look outside. When I started out as a .NET engineer, and at that point Java used to be, right? And we used to make all sorts of jokes at Java's expense, and then little by little I was exposed more and more to Java, and then you develop an appreciation of these things. Similarly, the more we go down the Agile route, I would say we should not ignore the fact that there are lessons that can be taken from all sides. And Agile also, there are different implementations or manifestations. Scrum, XP. If you are going down one route, doesn't mean that you cannot learn from the others. Now, the one I'm most used to is Scrum, right? But going through my prep for this presentation, the one word that came to me from XP, looking through it, was one of the core values, courage. Because some of these things, to address some of these things, to push back to say no, largely requires that character. Right? So don't look only within the focus of Agile alone. There might be something that you might be even able to pull from, let's say, waterfall. Hey, if the customer asks you for documentation, what are you going to do? You're going to say no. No. It's the requirement, right? So you might actually sit down and go about coming up with thorough documentation. Right? Then just take something from the waterfall playbook and apply it. Right? And the point that I'd like to make that I've been trying to stress indirectly, as far as the solution is probably not going to be technical. Always. Right? A lot of it can be handled by clear communication, by dialogue with the customer, rather than focusing only on technical solutions. The biggest takeaway, right, and especially for those of you who are in management, architects already, who can actually influence this in your companies, try to get the customer on board with Agile. And by on board, I mean actually understanding what Agile means, inclusive of the positives and the negatives. Right? Because the more the customer understands more Agile, right, the lesser the chance of conflicts and confusion coming up along the way. Note, it will not be cheap. Right? I know companies that actually make the effort to do workshops for customers before their first engagement, saying, all right, this is what Agile is, this is what Scrum is, this is how we'll be running the project for you, this is what we can do for you, but this is your role in it. Right? This is how we're going to handle things. And the more they know about it, the more comfortable they are with it. And actually, even if it comes to saying, all right, we can't do this for you, they'll probably be a lot more comfortable having a dialogue with you at that point, rather than getting peeved or annoyed with you or upset. And automatically what happens is once you come to that point, it's hard to maintain that relationship with the customer continuously. So that's where that then-when-us mentality keeps building up. And I will suggest that as much as possible, try to educate them. Because if you can do that successfully, I think a lot of your problems will disappear, and this is perhaps your best hope of success. So these are the references that I use mainly in thinking through this, thinking through the prep for this session. The Agile manifesto, because I felt that, alright, it's Agile that we are talking about today with regard to software architecture. Let's try and go to the heart of Agile, the spirit. Like, what does Agile recommend? And then apply to the real world problems, because if you try to bring waterfall solutions wholesale, right from the top, then you're probably going to find two mixed metaphors, two models which wouldn't fit in well. So if we stem, or if our solution stems from the actual spirit of Agile, I figured that our chance of coming to successful answers or solutions will be higher. The second one is, of course, the paper that I referred to, the ITP paper by Martin Fowler. So I guess it's time for Q&A session, right? Questions? No guarantees of answers, but questions?
One of the problems as founders face is that when you have a distributed team, it's really challenging that you in the problem, we need to wait that day and reality is understanding and maybe we have certain things in our framework, but we don't know what it is all about. And it's difficult to communicate about it. They can know what it is all about rather than having a person receive it. So that is one of the biggest challenges in this case.
So how I would suggest that you could handle it is again the whole communication angle. Because the problem with, again, outsourcing often is that they never work with us. First time you sign up, maybe they've seen our client preferences and all of that, we start working. And then what happens? You hit a bottleneck or a problem point like this, and they think that you're trying to be smart or that you're trying to, cheat them out of something. Because they are thinking defensively. Right? So if you could set expectations with them beforehand, saying that this is how this thing is going to roll out, and maybe run a few scenarios like this. Right now, you've done this a few times, you all have seen the problems that can come up. Then try to educate them about it beforehand, so that when the problem does come up, it's not a surprise. Because most times I've found that what upsets customers is that nasty shock, nothing else. Right? And even if they get tough on you at that point, it's not because they're trying to be nasty typically. It's just because they're worried. They are just insecure, or they're just worried that, that you're trying to build them for something that you're not going to add value with. So if you can just, educate them early on, I think a lot of those things will settle. Right? And of course, I don't think there's much that can be done about the whole time zone difference thing. I mean, that's a reality of offshoring. And hopefully, the fact that it's a lot cheaper to run it offshore should hopefully make up for a few of those things. Right? Those are things that we don't always take into account when we do our estimates for projects. Right? We just go ahead and just look at the functionality, or it will take this much to do it. What about the overhead of issues like that? You don't consider it?
One of the issues that we've been concerned about there is that we like more readable code, and the communication over the website, we have one way of reading that. We have less to this stuff.
I'd love to tell you that by doing all of this, your whole problem will be solved, but I'd be probably lying at that point. So I would much rather that, like I said, take the specific issues, right? Take the specific issues. See, architects are supposed to be problem solvers, so, now there's a really worthwhile problem they have to solve. So if you solve that, you've done a much bigger thing than coming up with any architecture, right? So if you could think through that, and hopefully next time you'll be presenting with your solutions, right? I think that's probably what you need to do, try and figure out what works in your case, because there are specifics to your organization, like you said, your architectures, your preferences of technology, the approaches that you are doing, as well as your customer. They will have their own quirks, their own individual idiosyncrasies, which you all need to work around. So if you all can try and make those things visible to each other early on, I think a lot of these problems will disappear. I think you're doing the absolute nightmare scenario of using the US as an example to the director time difference, right? If it was at least Australia or Scandinavia, you could talk about time overlap, right? But you took the US. Thank you very much. Right? Okay, I think there are scenarios there for us, like that, which might require little documentation. If there's any overlap, or if there's any option of working, let's say different shift or something like that. That's a scenario that I've faced where we worked a 2 to 10 shift on call days, for example. Right? That shortcomings of the model between you and the customer might help a little bit. Again, I'm not saying that there's a silver bullet solution for any of these. You might have to address your individual pain points in different ways. And if you can do that, I think you might see not only will some of your problems solved, you might actually get solved, you might actually see further solutions that you can apply at that point when you're already on that track. But I think the one of distributed teams is one of the pain points of offshore to start with, right? But that's also one of the things that are very much at the heart of Agile. So one option, as much as possible, send folks across from time to time, right? Something that was quite good, particularly I said the 27 years of experience that I've taken and the 60 years experience. What happened is we had a lot of other problems that I didn't mention in the scenario. We were working on remote desktop machines here. Of machines in Sweden, right? And developer productivity went down, right? But all they could really see, or all they could really care about was what we were checking, right? And unfortunately, I was in a situation that if we even say all the experience of connectivity is going to look like they are making excuses. Nonetheless, we went and do a little analysis. Just to give you an idea of the tricks or the approach we tried, I actually got that video, the lag, right, of when we try to perform an operation of scroll through the page, how bad it is. And we sent them a video clip just so that they could get an idea, right? But towards the tail end of the project, right, we actually had some of the team members sent on site, right? And automatically the customer process was easy, right? And it was one of those moments where, where we could happily say the issue was on the team, and that's what we were telling you all along, right? Post, if there's anything you could add to that, because he was the leader of the project all the way through, right? And he was on site for much of the time. And he's the guy I was interfacing with from here to try and put a lot of these issues down, right? If there's anything you can add to that, I think, because you felt the pain more than I did.
Well, that scenario, what actually we thought of, like bringing down the entire team to one group and normally we get together for certain kind of workshops to share the user experience and share reach the technology gap and things like that. But the objective was at that time to bring the entire team together, do few sprints, and learn from each other how we actually do it. And we learned like a lot of things from their architects and their senior developers, because they were like quite experienced and compared to us. Normally they just have senior developers, which they call like 15-16 years of developer experience, and there were like two architects who were like 30 to 40 years of experience in the software industry, and they were talking about object-oriented concepts which we have never heard of. So all these things were like coming down together to do the actual work, like brought up, increased a lot of productivity. Like earlier, our average were at that time when we were working remotely was around 48. But when we were on site, it increased up to 80% of productivity. So that was like proof that the product owners and the customers that it was actually the remote desktop kind of way of working, and that made us really frustrated.
One of the most interesting about that was that I was put on the project as an architect, right? But I wound up doing more PM work than anything else, just to make sure that they understood what the problem was. A lot of it was, if we were, because of the productivity, see what would happen is we give an estimate. And if, the estimate was something that didn't make sense for their level of experience, they shoot it down immediately. So then to actually just keep things going, you don't have to start quoting lower numbers. Then automatically we go over. Then we need to try and convince them that things were slow for a different reason, which was absolutely the truth. So a lot of the time, and what will happen is while I'm in office, I'm interfacing with them to try and convince them about these things. And then once the rest of the team has kind of gone home at that side, Coastal and I get on calls to try and figure out the technical issues that need to be sorted out. So it was almost like round the clock service. Now I'm not recommending this as a solution, but I'm just telling you that when these problems come up, that some of the solutions of, let's say, myself, using, or like tricks, if you would use the word, like sending, a video of how slow the lag is. I mean, that's not in any playbook. It's not in the playbook. It's not in the waterfall playbook, right? But it's just a problem-solving thing, right? So there are little things that you have to do like that. Some companies I've seen, they do profiles of the developers on that side. Their strengths, their weaknesses. Of course, you might want to hide the weaknesses when they pay visits to your office and all of that. It's just common sense. But I've seen companies do things like that just to try and get a better feel for each other and hopefully make things a little bit easier. For agility, urgent stuff, I think that's absolutely, let's say for example, so topics on fire, sometimes you have no choice but to wake up in the middle of the night. Yeah. Yeah. For scenarios like that, I think most guys on Skype working late, maybe at home, with mobiles in hand and all that. Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, at least sometimes we're dealing with customers, just letting them know about the fact that you are looking into their problem is enough for them. They don't need the solution here. The fact that you are attending to it is more than enough for them. Right? But actually, why I include so much of the coding is this. I was looking at more of the qualitative aspects and just gave the status or a little description won't suffice. Well, like, let's say, for example, it's a design system. Right? And you actually need to talk through the pros and cons. Right? And it's not something that can be, taken through, let's say, even by email. Right? You could use email, but then it might just take longer. Right? I was thinking more along lines like that, but I don't think that the verbal difference will ever truly be solved. Right? Sorry. But I don't think it will ever truly be solved, but you can do so many things to bring it close and minimize that effect. Anyone else who works on that basis using Agile, the verbal difference would like to fix it?
So in the long run, our setting is different. We are a product company, so it makes sense to have people on site. And I think that is a apparent clear enough solution. By the long term, what really solves the problem is ownership. Clear ownership of certain things like critical decisions that need to be made. Because right now I think a lot of the non-product related companies have to go through a customer architect or some sort of stakeholder on that side. I think that's the first transition or agreement that needs to happen, that you really have to make sure you are an owner and not just somebody who helps in engineering. And if you solve that problem, automatically everything falls in place. What we did is not practical for everybody. I mean, we have a very long-term relationship. So that's a different setting altogether. But the majority do come from services, consulting backgrounds. In such a situation, you attack the source of the problem, you find a lot of things falling in place.
So we are looking at that, think about being a big transit and being committed rather than just work. And there is someone who actually take the decision and own that decision. And rather than pass the ball, saying, well, you guys suggested this kind of thing. Being productive known about the product, once that knowledge is brought offshore, and that relationship is continuing over a long period of time, you can just keep on working on that model, right? And after a while, the amount of stuff that has been thrown across from that team to this team was kind of reduces as time goes by. I think you don't want to ask a question.
No, actually I'm not practicing perfect agile.
Not sure it exists either. Yeah.
Not into much in the agile as well. So what there were some instances taken in but my question this time is that now you talk about this budget. Now I don't really understand maybe like for knowledge I have that. So in this budget, you mean that it will be in fixed rate pound. So it is fixed budget. So it is then I don't know whether it's fixed rate pound or not even. So then how would this budget will work with agile?
I think there are other points for what that is. Was that it doesn't. Right?
Yeah,
but just to give some background to all of that, how it normally works is you're trying to, you go through a pre-sales cycle, right? And then you do a pre-sales estimate. But finalized cut for the requirements is not with you. Requirements is yet to be engineered, right? So with that high level knowledge, you do a high level estimate. And you contract on it, you sign off on that. Then you start engineering requirements, and then the problem becomes a lot clearer and the problems are a lot bigger. And typically that's what winds up happening in a lot of offshoring and outsourcing scenarios, right?
You don't agree on timelines.
Well, it's either deadline or effort, right? So we give an effort estimate and the amount is tied to the effort. Right? So what happens is that once the requirement is engineered, right, the breadth seems to be the same, the depth is increased. So already you talked about the sign-in page, sign-up page, etc., this functionality, that functionality. But let's say, for example, there might be a whole heap of business rules and workflows and stuff like that which become clearer or only available to you once you get the detailed requirement, by which point the horse is bored and you've already signed off. And that's where the problem is very common.
Now, say you approach the sign on agile and also say so we go to code. So the agile means what do you do now? Say first we identify one module or maybe one part of the requirement and we try to understand the requirement and we have some certain things planned and do it. And while that's going on, then you plan and understand the requirement. That's the way that
There will be one option, right? And that's the thing, and that's how it's supposed to happen. A lot of today's presentation was about it. That's how it should happen, even if we did it as a child, right? But let's say, for example, you put down function, right? You started doing in-depth into the user stories at the point of that sprint, when the sprint is taken up for development, and then you find that you're supposed to do more than you initially thought. Already you put your signature on the contractor and all. That's why I took on the slide that flexibility doesn't go away with agile. Because the customer is trying to get as much as possible or as little as possible, right? But from our side, we like to get the job done as fast as possible to that flexibility. So when you have two conflicting interests like this, how can you really work with or partner with or be one team when they are liaison or who is working with you want something other than what you want? Both parties want project time, but the additional factors are what's going to kind of, so everything, like you said, even in perfect agile, there are going to be days, right? Or even you count in the initial scope. As long as the customer is not willing to contest, when you say, all right, the scope has increased, great. Unfortunately, the real community do contest, even when there is actual scope. That's the problem. All right then. So, last chance. Going once, going twice, going thrice. All right. So in that case, it's time to put a full stop to the presentation, but not before thanking you for being here. Thanks for all the questions. It made things a lot more interesting than me just waffling on with the presentation. Thanks a lot to organizers as well, and hope to see you all at the next meetup. Thank you.